Hello, friends. Before we begin, this story needs your full attention. Have you ever driven across land so wide and quiet that your headlights feel like an intrusion, like you're trespassing just by being there? Out here, the ground stretches farther than the eye can track. Low hills, scrub grass, long shadows that never seem to move the way they should. During the day, it's beautiful in a lonely way. Sun-bleached earth, wind humming through open space. At night, that beauty thins out. The silence presses closer. Radio signals fade. Even your thoughts feel louder than they should. Nothing jumps out at you. Nothing chases you. But something waits. And the longer you're alone, the more you realize the land is paying attention. If you ever spent time somewhere like this, or even wonder what it would be like, listen closely. And if you haven't, you might want to think twice before judging what I'm about to say. My name is Caleb R. Holloway. I was a regional land enforcement ranger assigned to the Red Mesa Boundary District, and I worked that territory for 13 years. On paper, it was a quiet post. In reality, it was one ranger covering nearly 70 square miles alone. No backup most nights, no cell service, and rules that existed for reasons no one wrote down. I thought I understood this job. I was wrong, because there are things you learn out there that aren't in manuals, aren't covered in training, and will never, can never appear in an official report. I'm not supposed to talk about this, and every instinct I have tells me to stop before I go any further. But silence is how this land keeps its secrets, and I've carried them long enough. When people disappear out there, reports get filed, searches get logged, and explanations get simplified. What never gets written down are the rules we follow to survive the search itself. I was assigned to Red Mesa because I was steady, dependable, and didn't ask many questions. 13 years of patrols, welfare checks, recovery operations. All of it taught me procedure. None of it prepared me for what happens when the land decides you've stayed too long. If you're listening to this because you're curious, I understand that. If you're listening because you work somewhere remote, you already know what it's like to feel watched with no one around. There are 5 rules on that land. Everyone learns 4. The 5th one, you only learn if you break it. I didn't learn Red Mesa by studying maps or satellite images. I learned it mile by mile, patrol by patrol, the way you learn a person by their habits instead of their name. After my first night shift, the rules stopped feeling theoretical. The land had weight to it, a presence that pressed even when nothing was happening. Especially when nothing was happening. That realization settled slowly, quietly, and without drama, which somehow made it harder to ignore entirely. Red Mesa is a single landmark. It's a sprawl of high desert broken by shallow canyons, dry washes, and plateaus that look flat until you try crossing them. The soil changes color every few miles, rust red giving way to chalky tan. Then the blackened stone that absorbs heat like a battery. Vegetation is sparse but stubborn. Creosote bushes, thorny grass. The occasional juniper clinging to cracks where water briefly remembers to exist. During daylight, the horizon feels endless, a clean line where sky meets earth. At night, that line dissolves. Shadows stack on top of one another, and distances become suggestions instead of facts. Sound travels wrong there, carried too far, or swallowed entirely, depending on the wind. The terrain plays tricks on depth perception. A hill can look close enough to touch and still take an hour to reach. There are old cattle fences half buried in sand, abandoned shacks collapsing into themselves, and petroglyphs you're trained not to linger near. The land isn't empty in the way people think. It's occupied by time, by erosion, by things that don't need roads or names. Red Mesa doesn't announce danger. It simply waits for you to misjudge it. Maps simplify for convenience, but the ground itself resists simplification, shifting with seasons, storms, and decades of neglect that leave no clear record behind. Every feature feels provisional, as if the land could rearrange itself overnight without bothering to inform anyone. That uncertainty is the first thing you learn to respect there. My patrols followed a schedule that looked orderly on paper and felt meaningless in practice. I logged mileage, checked boundary markers, and verified that lock gates were still locked. Fuel management mattered more than time. A half tank too far from the station could turn routine into survival math. Most shifts were solo, 8 to 10 hours with no human contact beyond radio check-ins that sometimes echoed back with static instead of confirmation. I carried extra water, spare batteries, flares I hoped never to use, and a trauma kit heavier than my sidearm. When the sun went down, temperature dropped fast, and the desert revealed how little it cared about preparedness. There was no quick backup, no neighboring unit 5 minutes away. If something went wrong, it was on me to stabilize it or wait. That kind of isolation changes how you listen, how you watch, how you measure risk. You stop thinking in terms of policy and start thinking in terms of distance, light, and whether the road behind you will still be there when you turn around. Over time, the quiet becomes both companion and warning, depending on how closely you pay attention to out there alone. The first written rule was simple enough to justify to anyone who asked. After dusk, all patrols were required to remain on marked access roads. Officially, it was about safety, unlit terrain, unstable ground, the risk of getting stuck or injured where recovery could take hours. Reports cited twisted ankles, blown tires, and officers lost for entire nights before finding their way back. On paper, the rule reduced liability and kept response times predictable. Supervisors framed it as common sense, a boundary between controlled movement and unnecessary exposure. I enforced it without argument, logged compliance, and briefed new hires the same way I'd been briefed. It sounded reasonable because it was reasonable. Nothing in the language suggested fear, superstition, or anything beyond responsible land management. If you followed the rule, you stayed visible, trackable, and within reach. That's what we were told. And for a while, that explanation was enough. Among rangers, the conversation shifted once the radios were off. Rule 1 wasn't debated. It was accepted, like weather. Some said it was about wildlife spooked by headlights. Others about sinkholes that opened without warning. A few older hands spoke in half-jokes, warning rookies not to let the land get used to their footprints. No one laughed too hard. Stories circulated about vehicles found idling miles off-road with doors open and no sign of struggle, about tracks that started and simply stopped. These weren't campfire tales meant to scare. They were shared quietly, usually while checking gear or pouring coffee. The unspoken agreement was that curiosity had limits. You didn't test the rule to see if it worked. You followed it because everyone else did, and because breaking it never seemed to end cleanly. Official channels didn't ask why compliance was high. They just noted that it was. That silence felt deliberate, as if acknowledging the real reasons would make them real in a way no one wanted. If you've ever worked somewhere that makes its own rules, you'll recognize this feeling. Evan Torres had been on Red Mesa longer than anyone I knew. He spoke softly, moved deliberately, and treated the land like a colleague rather than a backdrop. Evan didn't lecture. He demonstrated. When he showed me patrol routes, he pointed out where tires always slipped, where radios died, where you slowed down even if you couldn't explain why. He never mocked questions, but he didn't answer all of them either. There was a weight to his pauses that suggested choice. Evan believed survival came from respect, not bravado. He checked on me during long shifts without making it obvious, a mentor who understood loneliness without naming it. When Rule 1 came up, Evan didn't justify it. He just said, "You'll feel it if you cross that line," and left it at that. Coming from him, that was enough. Trust like that is rare in places that test you daily. The first time something felt off, it was small enough to dismiss. I was returning along a marked road just after sunset when my headlights caught a stretch of fresh tire tracks veering away into open ground. They were clear, recent, and deep, the kind you don't miss. I slowed, checked my GPS, and verified the road hadn't shifted. It hadn't. Someone had driven off anyway. I logged it, marked the coordinates, and continued without following. As I pulled away, my radio crackled with a burst of static that sounded almost like interference from another channel. It stopped as soon as I acknowledged it. Nothing else happened, but the silence afterward stayed with me longer than the report I filed. The tire tracks I logged that night stayed in my head longer than they should have. Not because they were unusual. People ignore posted rules all the time, but because of where they led, or rather where they didn't. For the next few shifts, I caught myself scanning the open desert more than the road ahead. listening harder than necessary, as if the land might offer an explanation unprompted. It didn't. Red Mason never volunteers context. It waits for mistakes. The call came 3 nights later, just past midnight, when the temperature dropped enough to fog the inside of my windshield. I was moving slow along a southern access road, headlights low, radio volume turned up to compensate for the wind. At first, I thought it was interference, another burst of static riding the edge of a dead channel. Then the sound sharpened into something shaped, something almost familiar, a voice, faint, stretched thin by distance, calling out once, then again. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, hovering somewhere beyond the reach of my lights. The words were indistinct, swallowed by terrain, but the cadence was unmistakable. Someone asking for help. I stopped the vehicle and cut the engine. Silence fell fast, heavy enough to make my ears ring. The voice came again, clearer now that the engine noise was gone, drifting across the open ground to my left. It sounded tired, strained, the way people sound when they've already tried shouting and failed. I stepped out, boots crunching softly on gravel, and called back, identifying myself the way training dictates. My voice felt too loud in the open air, an intrusion rather than reassurance. The reply came a few seconds later. Same distance, same direction, no closer. That's when I noticed what wasn't happening. There were no echoes, no change in volume, no shift in position. Just a voice, fixed in space like a marker someone forgot to move. Rule 2 existed for moments like this. Never respond to voices without visual confirmation. Officially, it was about safety and misidentification, wind carrying sound, people under stress mishearing direction, the risk of walking into unstable ground or an ambush. The handbook framed it as restraint. A reminder that sound alone isn't evidence. In briefings, supervisors cited cases where officers chased echoes for hours, disoriented and exhausted, until daylight revealed nothing but open desert. The rule wasn't about disbelief. It was about verification. If you couldn't see the source, you didn't approach. You logged it, requested support if possible, and maintained position. That's what the policy said. Clean and unemotional, as if sound behaved the same everywhere. Standing there in the dark, with that voice calling my name now, my actual name, I felt how thin that explanation really was. I reached for my radio, thumb hovering over the transmit button. The channel hissed before I spoke, a low, uneven static that pulsed like breathing. When I tried to report the contact, my words clipped and distorted, chopped into fragments that bounced back at me a second later. I switched channels. Same result. The interference wasn't total. It was selective, swallowing certain syllables, leaving others intact. Enough to make a report useless. I logged what I could in shorthand, aware, even as I did it, that the entry would look incomplete, maybe unreliable. Documentation has limits out there. You can only record what fits into predefined fields, and there was no box for a voice that stayed still while you moved. When the static finally cleared, the voice stopped too, as if someone had flipped the same switch for both. Evan called me the next morning before I finished my report. He didn't ask for details right away. He asked how I slept. When I told him the truth, that I hadn't, he nodded, as if he could see me through the line. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that feels intentional. Then he said carefully, "Did you see anyone?" I said no. "Then you did write," he replied, not unkindly. I pressed him, asked if he'd ever heard it too. Evan didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low, steady, carrying weight without volume. "Sound doesn't always come from where it should," he said. "And sometimes it comes from where it shouldn't at all." He didn't elaborate. He never did. His restraint wasn't avoidance. It was protection. Some knowledge, once shared, becomes a burden you can't put down again. The dilemma gnawed at me over the next few nights. Every instinct I had, every reason I'd taken the job, pointed toward responding, toward helping someone who sounded lost and afraid. Ignoring a call for help felt like a violation of something deeper than protocol. But Rule 2 wasn't arbitrary. It existed because people had failed this test before, and the cost of that failure had been high enough to justify silence. Each time the wind shifted or the radio crackled, my body tensed, ready to choose again. I rehearse responses in my head. Imagine different outcomes. None of them clean. The land didn't care about my reasoning. It offered the same choice every time and watched what I did with it. The psychological toll was subtle at first, a low-grade vigilance that never fully shut off. I started second-guessing sounds that used to feel normal. Coyotes, shifting rock, my own footsteps. Sleep came in short stretches, punctuated by dreams where voices echoed without mouths. During patrols, I caught myself checking mirrors more often, listening for changes in pitch, in distance, in intent. The desert felt closer somehow, less abstract. I understood then that Rule 2 wasn't just about what you heard. It was about what hearing did to you. And as unease settled into something more permanent, I began to suspect there were other rules I hadn't been told yet, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. After the night of the voice, Red Mesa felt subtly misaligned, like a familiar room where someone had shifted the furniture an inch to the left. Nothing obvious changed. Patrol routes stayed the same, reports stayed routine, and the land looked exactly as it always had. But my attention kept snagging on details that used to pass unnoticed. Sound, especially, never fully settled back into the background. I followed Rule 2 without hesitation. Yet the effort of restraint lingered, leaving me alert in a way that felt less like professionalism and more like anticipation. The encounter happened during an early evening patrol, that brief window when daylight hasn't surrendered but shadows have started negotiating for space. I was driving a Western Access road when I saw a movement ahead. Silhouettes cresting a low rise where no marked trail existed. At first, I assumed they were hikers who'd underestimated the distance back to their vehicle. It happens often enough to be mundane. I slowed, adjusting my angle to get a better look. There were 4 of them, walking single file, evenly spaced, their pace unhurried. 2 unhurried. The ground they crossed was uneven, littered with loose stone and shallow cuts that usually force people to watch their footing. They didn't. Their heads stayed level, eyes forward, steps identical. Even from a distance, something about it felt rehearsed, as if they were following an internal line only they could see. I stopped the vehicle at the edge of my headlights' reach and observed. None of them carried packs. Their clothing was wrong for the terrain. Light jackets, clean lines, no dust. When one turned slightly, the movement was stiff, delayed, like a correction rather than a reaction. I reached for my radio out of habit, then stopped myself. Rule 3 surfaced unbidden, the way hard-learned lessons do. Never approach groups after dark. Officially, the rule addressed safety concerns, multiple unknown subjects, limited visibility, increased risk of confrontation. It emphasized observation over engagement, distance over authority. Approaching a group at night narrowed your options and multiplied theirs. The handbook didn't mention how some groups didn't behave like people who knew where they were going. It didn't need to. The rule existed because the pattern had already been recognized, even if no one wanted to articulate it clearly. I stayed where I was, lights off, engine idling low. The group continued forward, angling away from the road without acknowledging it. No one looked toward the vehicle. No one spoke. They moved too straight for the land, ignoring its contours as if gravity had been simplified for their benefit. Ranger training teaches you to read bodies before faces. Shoulders tell you intent. Hands tell you risk. Gait reveals fatigue, injury, confidence. These people gave me nothing. Their arms swung in sync, not loose, not tense. Their spacing never changed, even when the terrain demanded adjustment. It was like watching a diagram move. I told myself they were experienced hikers, disciplined, focused. I told myself that because the alternative required too many new rules, and I wasn't ready to consider those yet. When they disappeared into a shallow wash, the light swallowed them whole. I waited, counting seconds, expecting to see movement on the other side. Nothing emerged. I repositioned slightly, scanning the area with binoculars. The wash wasn't deep enough to conceal 4 adults completely. There were no branching paths, no cover dense enough to hide behind. It was simply empty. I logged the sighting with neutral language, careful phrasing, no speculation. By the time I finished, full dark had settled, and the desert resumed its usual stillness, as if nothing had crossed it moments before. I spoke to Evan the next day, choosing my words carefully. He listened without interruption, eyes on the map spread between us. When I finished, he traced a wash with a finger, then nodded once. "That's why Rule 3 exists," he said. I asked him if he thought they were lost. He shook his head. "Lost people look around," he replied. I asked if I should have done more. Evan met my gaze, and his expression unreadable. "You did enough by not doing the wrong thing," he said. It wasn't reassurance. It was instruction. Later that week, I requested consultation with an elder from a nearby community, someone Evan suggested without explanation. The meeting took place in a small office that smelled faintly of dust and coffee. I described what I'd seen, sticking to observation, avoiding conclusions. The elder listened, hands folded, eyes steady. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There are ways of moving that belong to the land and ways that borrow it." He didn't ask for details beyond what I offered. He didn't name what I'd encountered. Instead, he spoke about boundaries, about respect earned by distance, not intrusion. "Some things," he said, "notice you when you notice them. Better to let them pass." I thanked him and didn't ask follow-up questions. In places like Red Mesa, questions can be invitations. Cultural boundaries matter out there, and not just in the abstract sense. Rangers are taught to respect jurisdictions, traditions, and histories that predate our presence. We're guests, even when we wear authority on our sleeves. I understood that more clearly after the meeting. Not everything observed needs to be pursued. Not everything unexplained demands explanation. Sometimes the most respectful action is restraint, allowing space to remain intact. That doesn't make the unknown safer, but it keeps it contained. The land rewards that kind of discipline, or at least punishes its absence less severely. Still, unanswered questions have a way of accumulating. I replayed the encounter in my head, analyzing angles, timing, alternatives. I wonder where the group had gone, whether they'd ever been there at all in the way I understood presence. I compared the experience to the voice from nights earlier and felt an uncomfortable symmetry. Sound without source. Movement without adjustment. Patterns that stopped just short of breaking reality, but bent it enough to notice. By the time my next patrol cycle began, I sensed that Rule 3 was an endpoint. It was another threshold. And somewhere ahead, beyond groups and voices, waited a consequence for those who crossed too many lines without realizing it. By the time Liam Cole was assigned to Red Mesa, I had already stopped pretending the rules were temporary. They weren't training wheels meant to come off once you gain confidence. They were load-bearing. Liam didn't know that yet. He arrived with a kind of optimism that looked sturdy from the outside. Late 20s, sharp uniform, questions asked with genuine interest instead of challenge. He'd transferred from a forest district where trees absorb sound and trails announce themselves clearly. Open land unsettled him, though he didn't say it outright. He watched the horizon too often, as if expecting someone to step out of it. I was told to mentor him. Evan approved the assignment with a nod and nothing else. Liam learned procedures quickly. He memorized routes, double-checked gear, and treated every patrol like it mattered. I saw myself in him, or maybe I saw who I'd been before Red. Mesa recalibrated my expectations. He asked about the rules, all of them, and I gave him the official explanations first. He accepted those easily. When he asked why compliance mattered so much out here, I told him the truth I was allowed to tell. Distance kills faster than malice, and isolation doesn't forgive mistakes. I didn't tell him about voices or groups that walk too straight. Not yet. Some lessons need context before they make sense, and some context can't be rushed without cost. Rule 4 was introduced during his second week, folded into a routine briefing, like it was no different from any other. Never search alone after midnight. Officially, it addressed fatigue, visibility, and response limitations. Statistically, injuries and navigation errors spiked after extended shifts, especially during solo operations. The rule mandated staging, coordination, and daylight preference whenever possible. On paper, it protected everyone. In practice, it acknowledged something else, that after midnight, the land stopped behaving predictably, and having another set of eyes wasn't just support, it was anchoring. I emphasized the rule more than the others, watch and see if it landed. Liam nodded, serious, respectful. Makes sense, he said. I believed he meant it. The call came on a night when everything else had already gone wrong. A storm system had rolled through earlier, cutting visibility and knocking out a repeater station. By the time the skies cleared, it was well past midnight. A report came in of a missing surveyor who hadn't checked back in. Last known position was vague. Coordinates estimated from a partial transmission before the signal dropped. Liam and I were the closest units. Protocol said wait, coordinate, request additional support at first light. But the surveyor had been alone, inexperienced, and the temperature was dropping fast. Liam looked at me, jaw set, eyes bright with urgency. If it were us, he said, we'd want someone to come. He wasn't wrong. That was the problem. I hesitated longer than I should have. Every rule we had learned pressed against the same instinct that had drawn both of us to the job. Help when you can. Don't abandon people to the dark. I told myself we could stage together, cover ground efficiently, bend the rule without breaking it. Evan wasn't reachable. The repeater was still down. The decision settled on me, heavy and immediate. I authorized a search, then compounded the mistake by splitting up to cover more area. Liam didn't argue. He trusted me. That trust is something I still carry, heavier than any gear I ever wore. We established radio check-ins every 10 minutes and moved off in opposite directions, lights sweeping low. At first, everything was normal, too normal. The land lay quiet, dampened by recent rain. Sounds muted. 10 minutes passed. Liam checked in, voice steady. 20 minutes. Another check-in. Then the silence stretched past 30. I called his name, tried different channels, adjusted my position to improve reception. Static answered me, thin and uneven. I told myself it was interference, terrain, bad timing. When I reached the last agreed point, I found his tracks leading into a shallow canyon. They were clear, purposeful. I followed them, breaking Rule 4 again without thinking, heart pounding hard enough to feel in my throat. The tracks ended abruptly near a rock outcropping. No signs of struggle. No dropped equipment. Just absence, clean and final. I called until my voice cracked, scanning the canyon walls, the floor, the darkness beyond my light. Nothing answered. When backup finally arrived hours later, daylight diluted the scene into something almost ordinary. Search patterns expanded. Drones flew. Dogs worked the perimeter. We found nothing. No body. No gear. No explanation that fit inside a report. The official documentation was thorough and hollow. Timeline established. Protocol deviations noted. Environmental factors emphasized. Liam's disappearance was classified as an unresolved incident pending further evidence. I wrote my statements carefully, accurately, leaving out the weight behind each choice. Reports don't record guilt. They don't measure the cost of trust misplaced or rules bent for the right reasons. They just sit in files, complete and insufficient. I signed my name where required and felt it lose meaning. The emotional fallout didn't announce itself. It settled in layers. Evan didn't reprimand me. He didn't console me either. He placed a hand on my shoulder once, brief and steady, then went back to work. Liam's locker stayed untouched longer than necessary. I avoided the canyon where his tracks ended, rerouted patrols without admitting why. Sleep became optional. Every decision felt heavier, each rule sharper. Red Mesa hadn't taken Liam because he was careless. It had taken him because we believed urgency excused solitude. As the days passed, I understood that Rule 4 wasn't about midnight at all. It was about what happens when you think you're an exception. And somewhere ahead, the land was still waiting to teach the rest of that lesson. After Liam vanished, Red Mesa didn't pause. It never does. The search operation unfolded the way all official responses do, methodical, layered, and quietly constrained by resources no one liked to acknowledge. Incident command was established by mid-morning, maps spread across folding tables, grids drawn and redrawn. Teams rotated in from neighboring districts, each brief with the same neutral language that stripped the event of its sharpest edges. The process was efficient, practiced, and deeply impersonal. Every hour had a form. Every decision required approval. The land was reduced to coordinates and probability curves, and Liam became a subject instead of a person. Watching it happen felt like standing outside my own body, aware that the machinery was working exactly as designed, and that the design had never accounted for outcomes like this. Search and rescue protocol thrives on documentation. Tracks are photographed, weather logged, terrain classified, but there are limits to what can be captured. Certain observations resist translation into official language without sounding speculative or unprofessional. When I tried to explain how Liam's tracks ended too cleanly, how the ground showed no signs of disturbance beyond that point, it was chalked up to soil composition and wind. When I mentioned radio anomalies during the search window, they were attributed to storm damage. Each explanation was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a wall of plausibility that left no room for the parts that didn't fit. The system wasn't malicious. It was protective. It filtered out anything that threatened coherence, anything that suggested the rules weren't enough. There were things I noticed during the search that never made it into a report. Areas where sound seemed dampened, where shouted names fell flat instead of carrying. Equipment that malfunctioned only in specific zones, then worked perfectly once moved a few yards away. Dogs that refused to cross invisible boundaries, planting their feet and whining softly until handlers backed off. These weren't dramatic failures. They were inconsistencies, small enough to dismiss individually, but persistent enough to erode confidence. I wrote what I could, edited what I had to, and learned quickly where the edges of acceptable observation lay. The space between reports grew wider than the reports themselves. Evan changed after Liam disappeared. He grew quieter, his movements less precise, as if some internal calibration had been thrown off. One night, weeks into the stalled investigation, he asked me to walk with him along a familiar stretch of road. We didn't bring radios. The sky was clear, stars sharp enough to feel intrusive. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Evan stopped and looked out over the open land, shoulders sagging in a way I'd never seen. "I've lost count," he said, voice rough. "How many over the years?" I didn't ask him to clarify. He didn't need prompting. He told me about incidents that predated my assignment, names that never left internal memory because they never fit the paperwork. He admitted that the rules had been learned the hard way, passed down informally because formal acknowledgement made them harder to enforce. Once it's written, he said, people test it. His restraint cracked, then grief and frustration bleeding through. He confessed that he'd broken rule for once, years ago, and survived by chance rather than judgment. Someone else hadn't. He carried that weight daily, and now I carried it too. After that conversation, the land felt less stable. Not hostile, just inconsistent, as if it were responding to attention in ways I couldn't predict. Familiar routes took longer to traverse without any clear reason. Landmarks appeared shifted, subtly out of place, forcing me to double-check navigation more often than before. It wasn't dramatic enough to call hallucination. It was closer to misalignment, like the desert was out of sync with its own memory. Evan noticed it too. He didn't comment directly, but he adjusted patrol patterns, avoided certain areas without explanation. The rules, I realized, weren't static. They evolved as the land did, adapting to pressures we barely understood. The moral dilemma deepened with every quiet shift. Following protocol meant accepting that some losses will remain unresolved, sealed behind procedural language, and archived without closure. Breaking protocol meant risking more lives, adding to a ledger that never balanced. I thought about Liam often, about the choice that put him alone in the dark, about how easily urgency becomes justification. Red Mesa didn't force that decision. I made it. The land simply responded. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed, then stalled. Liam's name moved from active search to unresolved case. Life went on, thinner for it, and in the widening space between what could be written and what had to be known, I sensed another rule taking shape, unspoken but inevitable, waiting for the moment when denial would no longer be enough. After enough time passes, individual incidents stop standing alone. They begin to line up. I didn't notice at first because the cases were separated by years, paperwork, and different supervisors with different priorities. But once Liam's file joined the others in the unresolved cabinet, patterns started to emerge that I couldn't ignore anymore. Disappearances clustered around similar conditions. Late hours, low visibility, moment of urgency that pressured someone into bending a rule just this once. Tracks that ended cleanly. Radios that failed selectively. Searches that expanded outward without ever finding a center. None of it was dramatic enough to raise alarms on its own. Together, it formed a shape I couldn't unsee. Red Mesa didn't take people randomly. It responded to specific circumstances, almost like a system waiting for the right inputs. I began cross-referencing old reports during slow shifts, staying strictly within what I was authorized to access. Even then, the gaps were obvious. Entire sections summarized in a sentence. Attachments missing. Language that danced carefully around direct statements. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was avoidance. Everyone who worked long enough out there eventually brushed against something they couldn't explain, and most learned quickly that naming it didn't help. The unspoken agreement was that silence kept you operational. The fifth rule lived in that silence. No one wrote it down. No one briefed it formally. But everyone who stayed long enough adjusted their behavior around an absence, a shared understanding that there was a line you never crossed twice. The rule itself was never articulated, only implied through warnings that stopped short of clarity. Don't linger. Don't push it. Know when to leave. These phrases floated through conversations without anchors, offered as advice rather than directives. When someone asked for specifics, the answers blurred. Evan was particularly careful, choosing his words like tools he didn't want to dull. I once pressed him, frustration leaking through professionalism, asking what exactly happened if he broke all the rules. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You don't break it. It breaks you." That was as close as anyone ever came to naming the fifth rule. Not an action to avoid, but a threshold you didn't survive understanding. Looking back, the signs had been there long before Liam. I ignored them because acknowledging them would have required me to change how I saw my job. There were days when the land felt heavier, when the air seemed resistant, like moving through water. Moments when my reflection in the windshield looked slightly delayed, as if my face needed time to catch up with itself. I dismissed these as fatigue, stress, the natural cause of isolation. I ignored the way my name sometimes sounded wrong over the radio, stretched or flattened, like it belonged to someone else. Each sign was small, explainable, easy to compartmentalize. Together, they suggested that attention itself carried weight out there, that being noticed was not the same as being seen. The psychological deterioration wasn't sudden. It crept in quietly, reshaping my routines without announcing itself as a problem. I stopped listening to music on patrol because it felt intrusive. I began eating meals in silence, aware of every sound my body made. Sleep became shallow, interrupted by dreams where I followed rules I couldn't remember learning. My thoughts looped more often, circling the same questions without resolution. Was the fifth rule about curiosity? About attachment? About staying too long in one place? The land offered no answers, only consequences. I found myself scanning the horizon not for threats, but for recognition, a sense that something was paying attention in a way that felt personal. That awareness was worse than fear. Fear implies danger. This felt like assessment. Evan noticed a change before I did. One evening, after a patrol that left me shaken without clear reason, he asked me to sit with him outside the station. The sun was setting, painting the mesa in layers of red and shadow. He didn't lecture. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "You're getting close." I asked him to what? He shook his head. "That's the problem," he replied. "Once you can name it, it's already too late." His voice was calm, but there was urgency beneath it, a rare crack in his composure. He told me that some rangers leave before they cross that line, sensing the shift and choosing distance over understanding. Others stay, convinced they can manage it, document it, control it. Those are the ones who disappear or worse, remain but lose something essential in the process. Before we parted, Evan offered a final warning, quiet enough that it felt more like a confession than advice. "The fifth rule isn't about what you do," he said. "It's about what you let the land do to you." He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask. The meaning settled anyway, heavy and unavoidable. As I watched the light fade from Red Mesa, I understood that the rules I'd learned were only the surface layer, safeguards against something deeper that didn't want to be understood. And in the growing space between what I knew and what I could endure knowing, I sensed that the land was waiting to see which side of that line I would choose. I didn't plan for it to happen the night it did. Nothing about that shift stood out when it began. No missing persons report, no weather alert, no sense of urgency riding the radio traffic. That should have been my first warning. Red Mesa rarely leaves you alone without reason. I signed out a vehicle, logged my route, and drove west along an access road I'd traveled hundreds of times. The moon was low, casting shallow light that flattened the landscape and erased depth. The quiet felt deliberate, heavier than usual, like the land had drawn a breath and was holding it. About an hour into patrol, the road markers stopped matching my odometer. Distances stretched, each mile taking longer than the last. I checked my GPS. It insisted I was where I should be. The engine sounded wrong too, muted, as if wrapped in cloth. I slowed, senses sharpening. Every rule I'd learned rising unbidden. When the radio crackled, I reached for it, then froze. The sound wasn't static. It was layered, overlapping fragments of transmission that didn't align in time. A call sign from years earlier surfaced briefly, then vanished. My own voice echoed back before I spoke. That was when I realized the escalation wasn't external. It was happening around me, folding inward. The road ahead warped subtly, not bending so much as repeating itself. Landmarks appeared twice, then a third time, each instant slightly altered. I felt the pull to stop, to step out and orient myself. Rule 1 said stay on the road. Rule 2 said don't respond to what you can't confirm. Rule 3 said keep distance. Rule 4 said don't be alone. The 5th rule said nothing, and that silence was loud. I kept driving, gripped tight on the wheel, heart steady only because panic wouldn't help. That restraint felt borrowed, as if it didn't fully belong to me anymore. The distortion peaked without spectacle. No sudden noise, no flash of movement, just a sense of compression, like the space around the vehicle had narrowed. The air thickened. Headlights illuminated less than they should have, the beam dissolving into a gray shimmer a few yards out. Sound flattened completely. I could hear my breathing, my pulse, nothing else. Then the road ended. Not abruptly, not with a drop or barrier. It simply ceased to exist, replaced by open ground that hadn't been there moments before. The vehicle rolled to a stop on its own. The engine died. I didn't see it arrive. One moment the space beyond the headlights was empty. The next it wasn't. It stood where the road should have continued, occupying space without displacing it. Its shape suggested a person only because my mind needed a reference point. Proportions were wrong, too precise, as if assembled from memory rather than anatomy. It didn't move, but it wasn't still either. The edges of it shifted, corrected, like an image trying to resolve. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't look away. The longer I focused, the less certain I was that I was seeing something external at all. It felt like being observed through myself. There was no fear in that moment. Fear requires threat. This was assessment. The same cold attention I'd felt building for months. I understood then that this wasn't an encounter meant to harm or communicate. It was a boundary check. The land had noticed how close I was getting, how many rules I'd learned, how many I'd broken. The presence didn't speak. It didn't need to, meaning pressed in from all sides, heavy and wordless, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I tried to approach, to document, to understand, I wouldn't leave. Survival came down to intuition shaped by restraint. I stayed in the vehicle. I didn't reach for the door, the radio, my weapon. I didn't acknowledge it beyond awareness. I focused on what the rules had always implied rather than stated. Minimize impact, reduce attention, leave no trace. I closed my eyes, slowed my breathing, and thought of nothing specific. Not Liam, not Evan, not myself, just absence. I don't know how long that lasted. Time felt irrelevant, stretched thin. When I opened my eyes again, the road was back. The engine turned over on the first try. The headlights cut cleanly through the dark. I drove until dawn without stopping. The aftermath was defined by silence. No radio anomalies. No distorted landmarks. No lingering sense of presence. It was as if the night had been erased, leaving only exhaustion in its place. I filed a routine patrol report that morning, clean and accurate, omitting everything that mattered. Evan read it without comment. When he looked up, our eyes met, and in that brief exchange, I knew he understood exactly what I hadn't written. We didn't discuss it. We didn't need to. The land had made its point, and I had survived by not pressing for more. But survival wasn't resolution. As the sun climbed over Red Mesa, I realized the encounter hadn't ended anything. It had only clarified what came next. The morning after that night, Evan didn't come in. At first, no one remarked on it. Rangers miss mornings for mundane reasons. Long shifts, weather delays, paperwork stacked too high to justify the drive. By noon, the absence fell heavier. I called his radio out of habit, already knowing it wouldn't answer. When the station finally acknowledged he hadn't checked out a vehicle or log leave, the day shifted tone. There was no panic, just a tightening, a sense that something inevitable had finished unfolding. They found Evan's truck late that afternoon, parked cleanly along a familiar stretch of road. Tires straight, engine cold. No signs of damage. No tracks leading away. His gear was inside, neatly arranged, as if he'd stepped out with the intention of returning. He didn't. The search followed protocol perfectly. Expanded grids. Aerial sweeps. Dogs. Nothing surfaced. No canyon. No wash. No anomaly that could be flagged without embarrassment. By the third day, no one said his name aloud unless necessary. By the end of the week, his status shifted from missing to unresolved, the same bureaucratic purgatory Liam occupied. Evan Torres, who had survived Red Mesa longer than anyone else, was gone without explanation, leaving behind only the weight of what he'd carried quietly for years. The consequences reached me next. Not immediately, not dramatically, but with the slow pressure of institutional gravity. My patrols were reassigned. My reports were reviewed more closely. A supervisor from outside the district asked careful questions that circled but never landed. I wasn't accused of anything specific. I wasn't cleared either. My decision-making during Liam's disappearance resurfaced, reframed as a pattern rather than an exception. The unspoken message was clear. Experienced and excused deviation, and deviation didn't look good on paper. Promotions evaporated. Opportunities narrowed. Red Mesa had a way of reshaping careers without ever acknowledging its influence. I kept working, because that's what you do when routine is the only thing holding you upright. An internal investigation followed, thorough, informed, and shallow by necessity. Investigators reviewed logs, communications, response times. They interviewed me twice, both times with a recorder on the table and a script that left no room for the questions I wanted to answer instead. When I hinted at inconsistencies, radio failures that didn't align with known damage, terrain changes that defied mapping software, I was gently redirected. Stick to verifiable facts, they said. The investigation wasn't designed to uncover truth. It was designed to establish compliance. Anything outside that scope was noise. The final report concluded with recommendations for infrastructure upgrades and training refreshers. Evan's disappearance remained unexplained. Liam's file stayed open. The system closed around them like a door that had never been unlocked. The psychological scars took longer to surface, and longer still to recognize as injuries. I started measuring my days by how quiet they were, how little attention I drew. I avoided certain roads without conscious decision, my hands turning the wheel before my mind caught up. Sleep came in fragments. When I dreamed, it wasn't the presence I'd encountered, but of paperwork. Forms that never ended, signatures that smeared into illegibility. I caught myself listening for things that never came, bracing for assessment that didn't arrive. The land had receded, but the awareness remained, a low-grade hum beneath every thought. I understood now what Evan had meant when he said the fifth rule wasn't about action. It was about erosion, about what stayed with you after the land decided you were done learning. Colleagues noticed a change but didn't comment. In places like Red Mesa, emotional privacy is a survival skill. You don't ask questions you might not want answered. I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what almost had, how close I'd come to crossing a line, that wouldn't let me back. That awareness sharpened everything else, stripping away illusions I'd relied on for years. I could still do the job. I just couldn't pretend it was the same job anymore. The decision to leave didn't arrive all at once. It assembled itself over weeks, built from small moments of recognition. Standing alone at dusk, realizing I was relieved when nothing happened. Reading Evan's name in a report and feeling more responsibility than grief. Understanding that staying wasn't an act of courage, but of inertia. When I submitted my transfer request, no one argued. Red Mesa releases people quietly, the way it takes them. On my last patrol, I followed every rule perfectly and felt, for the first time, like that was enough. As I drove away, the land didn't react. It didn't need to. It had already left its mark, and that was consequence enough. Leaving Red Mesa didn't end my relationship with it. Distance rarely does. What it gave me instead was perspective. Enough space to understand why the fifth rule was never written down, never formalized, never allowed to exist in ink or policy. Writing would have implied control, and control was the one illusion the land punished most consistently. The moment something is documented, it invites testing. People look for boundaries to press against, exceptions to exploit. A written rule becomes a challenge instead of a warning. Out there, warnings only work when they're incomplete, when they leave enough uncertainty to inspire restraint. The fifth rule survives precisely because it resists definition. Naming it would flatten it, turn something adaptive into something rigid, and rigidity is fatal in a place that shifts according to attention. I thought often about how many incidents could have been avoided if the rule were explicit. Then I thought about how many more would have occurred once people tried to prove it wrong. Curiosity is an occupational hazard in enforcement and investigation. We're trained to resolve unknowns, to push past discomfort until clarity emerges. Red Mesa operates on the opposite principle. Clarity is the threat. The fifth rule exists to preserve ambiguity, to keep people from pushing past the point where understanding becomes participation. Writing it down would have made it portable, transferable to people who hadn't earned the context to carry it safely. Silence, I realized, was the only containment that worked. Over time, I stopped thinking of the land as a location and started thinking of it as a participant, not alive in any way that fits human definitions, but responsive. Red Mesa didn't act. It reacted. It adjusted based on patterns of behavior, attention, and repetition. Rangers who treated it like a backdrop lasted longer. Those who treated it like a puzzle didn't. The land remembered routines, noticed deviations, and responded when certain thresholds were crossed. That didn't make it malicious. It made it selective. Understanding this reframed everything I'd experienced. The voices, the groups, the distortions, they weren't attacks. They were feedback, signals that someone was getting too close to interacting rather than observing. This perspective made institutional silence easier to understand, if not easier to accept. Agencies are built on the premise that risks can be mitigated through policy, that unknowns can be reduced to variables. Red Mesa defied that framework. Admitting the fifth rule existed would have required admitting that some environments can't be fully managed, that authority has limits that can't be legislated away. Institutions don't handle that kind of admission well. It undermines confidence, invites liability, and forces uncomfortable questions about responsibility. So the silence persisted, reinforced by turnover and distance. New rangers arrived, learned the first four rules, and either adapted or left before the fifth ever surfaced for them. I wrestled with the ethical implications of that silence more than anything else. Was it right to let people learn through loss rather than instruction? Was withholding knowledge a form of protection or negligence? I thought about Liam, about Evan, about all the unnamed cases buried in summary paragraphs. The temptation to break the silence was strong, to write something, anything, that might spare the next person. But every time I considered it, I remembered Evan's warning. Once named, it's already too late. The fifth rule doesn't function as guidance. It functions as a filter. Those who sense it without needing it explained are the ones who might survive it. Those who need it spelled out are already approaching it the wrong way. The final ethical conflict wasn't about truth versus secrecy. It was about harm reduction in an environment where harm couldn't be eliminated, only redirected. By staying silent, we preserved a margin of uncertainty that kept some people cautious. By speaking too plainly, we would have encouraged others to test themselves against something that doesn't tolerate testing. The land didn't care about intentions. It responded to behavior. That understanding forced me to reevaluate what responsibility meant. Sometimes responsibility looks like omission. Sometimes it looks like letting others draw their own conclusions before they draw closer. Quiet acceptance came gradually, settling into me like sediment. I stopped trying to resolve the contradiction and let it exist instead. The fifth rule wasn't written because it couldn't be obeyed deliberately. It only worked when followed intuitively, when people sensed a shift and chose distance without needing justification. Red Mesa taught that lesson repeatedly, at a cost it never acknowledged. Accepting that didn't absolve anyone of guilt, but explained why the system remained intact despite its failures. As I moved further from that place, I understood that my role wasn't to explain the rule, but to honor it by not inviting attention back to myself. The land had finished teaching me. All that remained was to live with what I'd learned, and to decide how much it could ever be shared without reopening a door that was never meant to stay open. I'm far from Red Mesa now, at least in terms of geography. Years have passed. Enough that my badge number has been reassigned and my name no longer circulates in morning briefings. On paper, my career followed a reasonable arc: a difficult post, an unresolved loss, a transfer, eventual resignation. From the outside, it looks complete. From the inside, it feels paused. Some experiences don't end when you leave the place they happened. They settle into you, reshaping how you interpret quiet, distance, and attention. Even now, I measure unfamiliar landscapes by how closely they resemble that stretch of desert, how quickly they make me aware of myself as an observer. I don't dream about Red Mesa the way people expect. There are no replayed scenes, no faces emerging from darkness. What returns instead are sensations. The pressure of silence, the feeling of being evaluated without hostility, the awareness that restraint once mattered more than action. Those memories surface most often when I'm alone, driving long roads at night, when the world narrows to headlights and possibility. I've learned to recognize when my thoughts start circling familiar patterns, when curiosity begins to lean forward instead of settling back. That's when I remind myself that some lessons were paid for already, and repeating them wouldn't produce new understanding. Occasionally, there are signs that the land remembers me too, not in any dramatic way. Just small alignments that catch my attention before I can dismiss them. A radio picking up a fragment of a call sign that shouldn't exist anymore. A stretch of road that feels longer than it should. Markers arriving late. Once, while hiking in a completely different state, I saw a group crest a ridge and felt the same instinctive hesitation I'd learned to trust years earlier. They moved normally. They were just people. But my body reacted before my mind could argue. That reaction has never been wrong. It's not fear. It's calibration. I've come to believe that places like Red Mesa don't forget people who learn them too well. Attention leaves an imprint. Not enough to follow you. Not enough to intrude on your life. But enough to register recognition if paths ever cross again. That understanding keeps me from going back. Even out of curiosity. I don't need confirmation. I already know what acknowledgement feels like, and I don't intend to invite it a second time. If there's advice in any of this, it's simple, though not easy. When you work somewhere remote, somewhere that demands rules without explaining all of them, treat that lack of explanation as information, not a challenge, not a flaw, a signal. Don't assume every unknown exists to be solved. Some exist to define boundaries. If you feel the urge to push past a guideline because it seems arbitrary, pause and ask yourself who benefits from that curiosity. In my experience, it's rarely you. Distance is not failure. Restraint is not weakness. Leaving without answers is sometimes the most professional outcome available. Pay attention to how environments respond to consistency. Places that tolerate routine but resist deviation are telling you something important. When sound behaves strangely, when groups don't move the way terrain demands, when urgency pressures you to act alone, recognize those moments as tests, not invitations. You don't have to understand what's being tested to pass. You just have to know when to stop participating. The rules that matter most won't announce themselves. They'll make themselves known through discomfort, hesitation, and a quiet sense that continuing would cost more than it gives. If you're listening to this because you work somewhere that feels like it operates on a different set of assumptions, trust that instinct. If you haven't and you're simply curious, let that curiosity end here. There's no benefit in mapping every dark corner of experience. Some knowledge changes the shape of the person carrying it, narrowing options you didn't realize you valued. If you've ever driven a road at night and felt the urge to turn back without a clear reason, that's the kind of signal worth respecting. Share your stories if you need to. Compare notes quietly if it helps you stay grounded. But resist the impulse to chase clarity where silence has already done the job. I don't expect everyone to believe this. Belief isn't required. Neither is agreement. What matters is recognition. The land doesn't need your faith to function, and it doesn't punish disbelief. It responds to patterns, to repetition, to attention given too freely. Once you understand that, you stop asking what it wants and start asking what it allows. That shift alone is often enough to keep you on the right side of things. There are still 5 rules on that land. 4 of them are written, enforced, and easy to justify. The 5th remains exactly where it belongs, unrecorded and intact. I won't explain it. I can't. Not without doing harm. I don't have the right to cause. All I can do is tell you this. If you ever find yourself somewhere that feels like Red Mesa, somewhere that seems to watch how closely you're watching it, remember that leaving is an option, and sometimes it's the only one that counts.